Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this morning's webinar. My name is Stephen Maycock. I'm a development surveyor and associate here at Vickery Holman. I head up our development consultancy team where we work across the Southwest and provide a range of services to clients from development appraisals and valuations, including for secured lending, to financial viability assessments to support planning applications, affordable housing consultancy, land acquisition and disposal, and also dispute resolution. I'm based out of our Truro office, where my focus is largely valuations and viability work. I'm joined by two of my development colleagues, Tim West and Greg Oldrieve, and also by our guest speaker, Dan Rodgers from planning consultancy Bell Cornwell. I'm very grateful that you could join us this morning, Dan, and we look forward to hearing your insights shortly. So Tim and then Greg, perhaps you could just briefly introduce yourselves to the audience, and then Dan, if you'd also like to introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about Bell Cornwell, that would be great. So Tim, over to you.
My name's Tim West. I cover the development east business for Vickery Holman between the Bristol and Exeter offices. Much like Steve, my focus is on valuation, viability and development feasibility work.
Hi, good morning. I'm Greg Oldrieve. I cover dispute resolution for development services and also strategic advice and cover the whole of Southwest.
Good morning, everyone. My name's Dan Rodgers. I'm a planning consultant from the Bell Cornwell Partnership. We're a practice of chartered town planners with offices across the south of England. We cover all aspects of rural and urban planning with a wide range of clients. From house builders to developers, landowners, rural estates, farmers. So we cover a wide aspect of work. And day to day, I work directly out of our Cornwall and Devon offices. And my general practice is right across the southwest, from Cornwall up to Bristol and the Cotswolds.
Okay, thanks a lot for that, guys. So this is the first of a series of webinars that we're looking to roll out, with the theme being all things development. We're going to touch on several key areas this morning and offer a bit of an insight into what's going on in the sector generally. So that will include looking at the housing market, at rising costs, and also at land availability, before Dan will then give us a planning update and discuss some of the proposed planning reforms being considered. There will be an opportunity for some Q&A at the end, so if you do have any questions along the way, then please pop them in the chat box and we will do our best to answer them before the end of the session. So without further ado, allow me to kick off with the first segment, where I'll be looking at the craziness that is the current UK housing market. So let's start with the data. According to Rightmove, the average asking price in the UK now sits at 338,000. That's up 0.7% on June and sets a new record high for the average price of property coming to the market. It is the fourth consecutive month that a new record has been set. Nationwide recently reported that annual house price growth is now at 13.3%, the highest growth rate since November 2004. Most of this growth continues to be at the top of the ladder, followed by second steppers and then first-time buyers, although all sectors are showing month-on-month growth. In terms of supply and demand, the first half of 2021 saw 140,000 more sales being agreed and 85,000 fewer new listings than the long-term average. This has led to a shortfall of around 225,000 homes being available for sale. Homes with 4 beds are facing the biggest imbalance, with a 39% surge in sales and a 15% fall in numbers coming to the market versus 2019. The mass market 3-bed sector has seen a 28% jump in sales, while suffering a 10% drop in new supply. First-time buyers are faring best as a sector, with sales up 26%, but supply remaining relatively steady. The total sales stock for England and Wales is now at a record low. As a comparison, in June 2008, there were 868,000 properties on the market. Now the total sales stock is a mere 273,000. On the rental side, properties are being let out at a quicker rate than ever before. An average asking rents of homes outside of London has surpassed £1,000 per calendar month for the first time. Asking rents in Q2 of this year were 2.6% higher than in Q1 and 6.2% higher than in the same period last year. These are the biggest quarterly and annual jumps ever recorded. It's reported that the number of prospective tenants contacting agents about rental properties is currently 10% higher than in July 20. This fast-paced market has led to an annual drop of 36% in the number of available rental properties. So I think the question in many people's minds at this time is, are we in the midst of another housing bubble? The lockdowns triggered by the pandemic led to a 10% fall in GDP, which is the largest fall in about 300 years, yet house prices have grown at their fastest annual rate in 17 years. I would say the current boom is probably largely driven by circumstances of the pandemic rather than systemic problems, although both have played a part. The pandemic has clearly changed the way people now think about where and how they want to live their lives. Safety precautions that were introduced in the spring of last year, the likes of home working, have opened many people's eyes up to some of the benefits and enjoyment that come with that lifestyle, and it has forced some to think more carefully about their work-life balance. I think for a lot of people, returning to the office 9 to 5 days a week just isn't an option anymore. It's no longer the way a lot of people want to live their lives. And I think these are structural changes to working habits and a new normal for many. And it's these changes that we've witnessed over the last 12 months or so that has led to this significant increase in demand, especially for rural and coastal properties that we're now seeing, particularly in places like the Southwest, as people decide they want to continue working remotely in what they say is a healthier environment. One notable boom area has, of course, been Cornwall, which, according to Rightmove, has now overtaken London as the most popular search destination for property buyers across the UK. And we're seeing this on the ground as well, with some sites that we're involved in, particularly in popular locations where whole developments of 10 units plus, in some cases, are pretty much selling off plan before a shovel has even hit the ground. According to Nationwide, more than 20% of buyers who have moved or want to move say they want to get away from the hustle and bustle of urban life. It's reported that just as many 18 to 24-year-olds are now planning to move to the country as those looking at larger towns and cities, with the opportunity to work from home combined with more affordable property drawing people away. And there's been a clear shift in priorities as well, with increased desire for space to work from home, for example, as well as outdoor amenity. This is represented in the data that shows the biggest supply and demand imbalance is for larger properties. Clearly, the stamp duty holiday has been another major factor, which has contributed to the unprecedented levels of demand that we've been seeing and has helped ramp up prices. June, which was the last month prospective buyers could benefit from the full relief for properties priced up to £500,000, saw the highest number of property transactions ever recorded by HMRC in a single month, with over 198,000 transactions. That's up 61% on the previous month and 100% on June 2019. The relief has now reduced from 500,000 to 250,000 before resuming to its normal level of 125,000 from 1st of October. As I've already mentioned, there is a distinct lack of supply in the market, and this scarcity of new instructions, coupled with an increase in demand, is what's driving much of the house price growth. The Southwest has been the most seriously affected on this front, with 44% fewer instructions in June 21 compared to June 19. As we look ahead, there are a number of reasons to at least expect some slowdown in house price growth when you consider the potential for rising inflation and higher interest rates, the ending of furlough in September, and the end of the stamp duty holiday. Although it's worth noting that some early data would suggest that high activity levels are continuing despite the key June deadline now passing. My take on it is that we've probably passed the peak of buyer demand and prices should begin to cool off slightly. But I do believe that with demand likely to remain high, possibly fueled by the reintroduction of 95% mortgages, and with supply levels remaining low, that prices should continue to be supported in the near term. So that's what I think. But please, if you have an alternative opinion or different view, then please pop it in the chat box, as it'd be great to get some other thoughts on this. So hopefully that's been an interesting roundup for you. I'll now hand over to Greg, who's going to discuss rising costs in the sector and the impacts this is having on developments. Over to you, Greg.
Steve, thanks for that. If you thought house price increases were crazy, then cost increases are probably crazier, but we'll see about that in a minute. It's possibly the biggest concern in the development sector today is the increasing costs that we're all facing, and these threats are varied and multiple. The first up is build costs, and as I said before, this is challenged on several fronts as well, and some of the prices compared to Steve's house price increases look slightly worrying. Aluminium prices, for example, have increased by 12% since the 1st of July. Glass is up 10%, MDF 30 to 40%, timber 20 to 30%, and cement 15%, assuming you can actually get any supply at all. And possibly one of the bigger concerns is labour costs, and subcontract costs have gone up by about 10 or 15% in the last 6 months. These build cost increases are a result of a number of influences. The first is the strong demand for construction, and this is mainly fueled by the housing residential market, which is experiencing possibly unprecedented levels of activity, as mentioned by Steve earlier, but also it's fueled by the government's economic stimulation policy, which includes undertaking several big infrastructure projects across the country. Price increases are also influenced by supply chain constraints, and this is having an effect for a number of reasons, and it's various causes. The pandemic, with lockdowns, infection management, social distancing, and additional cleaning regimes in factories and warehouses, and now the pandemic is leading to staff shortages and resulting in decreased productivity from our suppliers. Brexit, with all the uncertainty around the process and now the additional bureaucracy, has also added to the issues on supply chain. And one of the least difficult or least publicised issues is the actual suppliers shipping containers, which is also making difficult to supply. The second area of cost increases is building standards. Changes to fire regulations brought about by Grenfell, post-Grenfell, and the government's sustainability drive, Future Homes, that seeks to reduce the CO2 emissions from residential properties by 75% by 2025, with an interim reduction by 2023 of 31%, is just two of the drivers for standards, which comes at a cost. The Part L changes that are driven by Future Homes consultation focuses on the M&E within residential properties, in particular heating and cooling. And there's a strong push towards solar panels, heat pumps, and heat recovery. I know one developer already who is installing heat recovery within shower trays, and I'm sure there are other of you who've got similar plans coming forward. Whilst future standards currently relates to housing, there is a consultation due shortly on commercial property. The third area of increase has been planning policy changes, and not only changes, but also the existing policies which are becoming somewhat more onerous. Biodiversity net gain is proven to be more of a challenge than I originally thought it would be. Whilst it can be managed, the process itself does come at additional cost. Phosphate runoff is the latest environmental concern to focus construction. Whilst it's been a concern and an additional cost in developments in the Taunton Deane area for some time, it's now confirmed to be a problem in the catchment areas of the River Camel in Cornwall, where development has been embargoed pending a review of how construction can forestall any further development, any further pollution. Lastly, in terms of cost increases, it's actually the programme delay and extensions of programmes which has added cost. Site management for the pandemic staff shortages, supply chain delays, all reducing on-site productivity and therefore slowing construction programmes. As Tim will tell us shortly, the delivery of houses is actually lower in the last year, despite all the furore and noise we hear about house construction. The results of the slower sales is obviously additional finance costs, or at least opportunity of cost for finance. Given the diversity, extent, and uncertainty around cost increases, there is every likelihood that this will be regarded as exceptional circumstances within any building contract, and this is likely to lead to further concerns and possible strains between developers and contractors and subcontractors. Fortunately, the housing market is making up for some of these increases, but the uncertainty is affecting future projects, especially those with more speculative nature. A few of the schemes we're currently involved in are certainly drawing breath and reviewing the opportunity for developments to go ahead. The optimists amongst us, which includes me, believe that material prices will again fall, probably not within 6 months, but certainly in the early part of next year. The futures market, apparently, whatever that is already shortening prices on timber and other base materials. Economists are suggesting that July actually saw a downturn in our economy and economic growth, which is, I am told, would taking the heat out of some of the price increases to a degree. In fact, the market seemed to have far more concern at the moment with the price of coffee, which I understand has just reached an all-time high of $2 a kilo or something in that sort of range. High building standards and planning policy compliance is something we should all aspire to. That said, the development industry should not be the scapegoat and or the fixer for all evils. Are high phosphate levels in watercourses really the result of development? An industry, we should be prepared to bear the burden of demands we impose on the community infrastructure by rectifying other people's mistakes should not be an imposition and potentially a constraint to the construction of new houses and building space for our community. All these cost increases have to be reflected in land value. As a result, our valuations for loan security at the moment are being couched with a valuation uncertainty clause, which advocates caution as our opinions are based on the latest information, which is changing on a weekly basis. When talking to landowners about the value of their land and its marketability, it's important that we have regard not only to the growth in the GDV, but also the growth in cost of actually creating developments at the moment. So we have challenges. Whilst demand for housing and workspace remains high, I'm sure we can overcome these. So that's the less of the doomsday from the costs. I'm going to pass you over to Tim.
So I'm going to have a little look back at the development land market over the last year and looking back a bit further towards the issues and trends which are shaping where we are currently. Okay, so as can be seen from this graph, house building completions in England remain at a much lower rate than their peak in the late 1960s, which isn't altogether a surprise, but does give us some context. So since 2015, as many of you will know, the UK government has pledged to deliver 300,000 homes a year in order to keep up with demand. The government has stressed that it's not just the number of homes being built, but also the balance of tenures and affordability, which need to be thought through for an effective housing strategy. This has been echoed in research commissioned by the National Housing Federation, which identified a need for 340,000 homes each year up to 2031, of which 145,000 must be affordable homes. I don't think any of us are experiencing a situation where that many affordable homes are being built in the context of the total. As we can see, though, the rate of delivery of new homes across the country is improving, but we are still falling short of the assessed need for housing each and every year, depending on whether you look at the 300,000 or 340,000 figure. Moving on, in 2020, English local authorities were asked to deliver 207,000 new homes, and they delivered more than 251,000, 121% of the target. The Ministry of Housing, Communities and Local Government have said that 2019 to 2020 saw the biggest increase in the supply of new homes in over 30 years, looking at housing supply figures. And the housing delivery test data seems to support this. In 2019, English authorities were at 109% of their target, and authorities delivered 4,000 more homes in 2020 than in 2019. But with all this, it still falls around 49,000 homes a year short of the much discussed target of 300,000. Moving on. So here we've got a heat map showing, focusing in on the south of England, and I'm going to focus in on the southwest, obviously. Just shows from green meaning good to red meaning bad, which local authorities are hitting their housing targets and by how much. So as you'll know, each local authority has a unique housing target based on their own household projections and objectively assessed need. And on average in 2020, across the country, not just the southwest, authorities were overperforming at 138% of their individual targets, rising from 117% in 2019 and 112% in 2018. However, a third of authorities within England were under 95% of their targets. So why is this the case? Are overperforming authorities less strict with their planning rules? Do they have lower requirements, less environmentally protected areas, better access to government funding, more green belt, less green belt? Are there infrastructure challenges that the council hasn't addressed? These are all questions that we need to consider, and the answers to which will highlight opportunities in the market at the moment and could prove very profitable for developers and house builders moving forward. Just having a look into the data here in the graph, we can see that Dorset, my home county, is performing especially badly within the southwest. with North Dorset at 59% of the target, Poole and Purbeck at roughly 73%, East Dorset and Christchurch rather at 91%. And then moving across, the only other affected areas within the southwest are North Somerset, which is at 81%, Bristol at 72%, and Torbay at 80%. And as we can see, the rest of the southwest seems to be performing fairly well. The current government has diagnosed the planning system as central to the failure to build enough homes over the last 20, 30 years, particularly where housing need is at its most severe. The recent planning white paper published in August 2020 will, the Prime Minister writes, signal radical reform unlike anything we have ever seen since the Second World War. Now, responses to the white paper are currently being analysed and everyone's going through the details. Some of the proposals are viewed as, let's say, highly controversial by professionals across the industry. It'll be interesting to see how these bits evolve. And I know Dan will be talking more on this, so I'm not going to try and cover it entirely. I will, however, talk about some of the ways it's affecting housing supply, or how I feel it will affect housing supply. So the paper does come some of the key barriers and potential solutions to increasing housing supply in England, some of which include potential contribution, investigating the contribution of local authority and housing association sectors to overall housing delivery. They seem to be delivering a disproportionate amount, and there needs to be an investigation why and how the private sector can assist with this. How to ensure more land suitable for development is brought forward and at a reasonable price, including how more public land can be brought forward more easily. How to properly resource local authority planning departments, this is a big one, and tackle a planning system that is widely seen as slow, costly and complex. Consideration of how essential infrastructure to support housing development can be funded, and how to encourage and support more small and medium-sized building firms into a market that's clearly dominated by a small number of very large companies. So now looking forward, and a bit of a look at 21. So Q2 2021 showed the strongest growth in greenfield land values since 2014, up 1.7%, and underpinned by an exceptionally well-performing housing market and continuing levels of demand and a shortage of supply of immediate land opportunities. The shortage of supply is creating pent-up demand, and increased competition for sites continues to push values upwards. Sites with immediate prospects or planning attached at between 50 to 150 units continue to attract the highest demand in the market and the strongest prices. The ongoing shortage of supply is also reflective of continuing delays to the planning system, which have been exacerbated by the pandemic, resulting in more limited land being allocated by local authorities across the last year and changing work practices which have frustrated an already delayed planning system. As local authorities move back into in-person meetings and working from the office, this frustration may in the short term be exacerbated as the COVID restrictions and new way of working is better understood. Although the impact caused by a combination of COVID, Brexit and a global surge in construction demand has seen a rise in build costs, materials and labour shortages, these seem to be currently outweighed by recent house price growth, although I know, Greg, having spoken to Greg and Steve, this is a little bit of a grey area, depends on how you think. This is true for the larger end of the market, though, with cost pressures still impacting the smaller and medium end of the market, where there is less ability to forward plan supply chains and absorb cost overruns. On the whole, though, activity and transaction levels continue to increase. The UK economy appears to be performing well. A stronger jobs market and continuing government support measures have encouraged more activity in the land market. If general economic recovery is sustained and supply continues to fall behind demand for sites, we expect to see land values continue to increase over the remainder of this year. Well, thanks for listening to me. Please feel to get in touch with any queries, and I'll hand over to Dan, who'll be giving you a bit of a planning update. Thanks.
Brilliant. Thank you. Thanks, Tim. And thank you guys for the invitation and for asking me to speak today. I really appreciate it. I've been asked to obviously cover some planning reform issues, and I just wanted to run through a few of the items, provide a snapshot of what I think are some of the big announcements that have been made in the last 12 months. Obviously, if anyone wants to catch up after the talk today, please feel free to contact me. You can either Google search my details or find me on LinkedIn, or otherwise, speak to the guys at Vickery Holman, and they'd be happy to share my contact details. So in terms of planning reform and changes to the planning system, if you follow the planning press, reform is pretty much constantly touted. Changes often frequently happen, with the latest change being probably the major change being the introduction of an updated version of the MPPF with MPPF 5 being published just last week. I also need to caveat that much of what I'm about to say are still ideas and concepts. The white paper, for example, sets out a lot of visions and concepts for the planning system, but in many respects, it's more like a green paper, as it is light and undetailed in some respects. So it's unclear at this stage how some of these ideas will be delivered in practice. But to give you a snapshot of where we've been, if we go back, and a bit of context, if we go back 12 months or so, back in July 2020, we saw the Business and Planning Act come into play, and that made provisions for the promotion of economic recovery and growth as a result of the pandemic. The Act set out some urgent and mostly temporary measures, which included flexible construction hours, extensions to planning permissions, and essential still relief for the development industry during that time. We've also seen the further expansion of the permitted development regulations. We do a lot of this work as practice and lots of prior approval applications, and ultimately further rights have come into play that facilitate more upwards residential extensions to existing apartment flatted blocks and also residential dwellings. And also a permitted development right that actually allows the demolition of buildings, either commercial, light industrial and residential, and their replacement with purpose-built residential buildings to deliver more homes. I need to caveat both of those permitted development rights have a lot of clauses in, meaning that the opportunity that exists potentially isn't what it seems what it is, because there are so many criteria that you have to meet to benefit from those permitted development rights. But it is a sign of the kind of government's intention and the direction in which they're taking the planning system. We've also seen some softer alterations to permitted development rights, such as extended time periods for temporary uses on sites. An example being obviously the emergence of pop-up campsites, extending those periods for 56 days as a direct result to the demand for staycations as a result of the pandemic. We've also seen a new simplified use classes order with Class E coming into effect on the 1st of September 2020, which essentially groups a number of high street uses that traditionally fell into their own use class, such as retail uses, financial services, and offices, bringing them into one single use class, so that ultimately you can switch between those uses under Class E. The objective of this is obviously to help support the economy, particularly the high street in its recovery from the COVID-19 pandemic, and obviously the changing way in which we're starting to use town centres with the rise of online shopping and such like. So those pointers are really just some of the major kind of tangible changes that we've come into effect and we can actually see on the ground in the last year. The next section that I'm going to talk about covers some of the consultation ideas that have emerged, along with some of the details in the white paper. So firstly, I wanted to touch on the imaginatively titled Changes to the Current Planning System consultation, which was introduced alongside the planning white paper and touted a number of possible changes. One of those included revising the standard method for calculating housing need. That's something that I'm going to touch on in a moment. The provision of first homes, which I think came into play earlier this month. First homes being a type of affordable housing and essentially a type of discount market sales affordable housing. There are also suggestions in the consultation to temporarily lift the small sites threshold, below which developers would need to contribute to affordable housing, taking that up to either 40 or 50 units. However, that's a measure we heard earlier this year that is not likely to be taken forward now. There's also quite an interesting consultation on enabling major housing-led developments to be permitted through the permission in principle route. We do a lot of permission in principle applications as a practice. It's a good way of kind of testing the water for certain types of development. But at the moment, they're limited. If you put in an application for permission in principle, they're limited to minor development. So for residential schemes, that would limit you to proposals for up to 9 dwellings, for example. So there is talk of expanding this and opening that up to a wider remit, albeit we've yet to hear whether that will be forthcoming. I then just want to run through some of the headline issues in the planning white paper, Planning for the Future. This was obviously a big headline grabber. It was announced to much fanfare back in 2020. And Boris Johnson obviously talked about ripping down and ripping apart and tearing down the planning system and starting again. At the heart of the white paper is the concept of the 3 pillars. Pillar 1 being planning for development, pillar 2 being planning for beautiful and sustainable places, pillar 3 being planning for infrastructure and connected places. I mean, taking some of the key issues and key themes that come out, I suppose one of the major reforms is the reform proposed for local plan preparation. A big change is proposed, with the implications being that we would move away from the current local plan system, which is obviously the heart of our development management system, to a zoning approach that requires local authorities to zone land into one of the following 3 categories. In the first instance, you should have growth areas, which would essentially be your allocations. These are areas where development would effectively be approved and planning permission delivered at the same time that the plans are prepared and adopted, resulting in the quick and efficient delivery of big infrastructure, your new schools, large housing schemes, shops and business space. But there'd be a requirement to meet local design codes and local design standards that would have to be set by the local authority as part of that plan preparation. You then see renewal areas. These would be classified under a bracket where they would be suitable for some development, and this would cover existing built-up areas, your existing kind of villages and towns where smaller scale development is appropriate, or it would be likely to. Then you'd also have your protection areas, which obviously seems as though it would allow local authorities to understandably protect such areas as national parks, areas of outstanding natural beauty, and those sensitive areas from inappropriate development. However, obviously setting that out into 3 different groupings sounds fairly simple. However, that approach goes fundamentally to the heart of the kind of town planning legislation that we have that governs the country at the moment. So deliver such a change in approach, ultimately requires changes to law, which no 2 ways about it takes time and will take time to emerge, and obviously various further consultation. Also, just because of obviously the audience here today, I thought it might be interesting to touch on the introduction of the National Infrastructure Levy. Essentially, the reason for a new levy that's been touted is due to the fact we currently have a dual approach to delivering infrastructure. Section 106 agreements that we have in place obviously focus on site-specific mitigation. Each agreement needs to be negotiated individually with the local planning authority as well, which, as many developers will know, can be a time-consuming and sometimes unpredictable process. Therefore, the Community Infrastructure Levy, CIL, was introduced to allow local planning authorities to charge a fixed rate depending on the size and type of development, with the aim of creating a faster and more transparent system. However, CIL itself is often criticised for being inflexible, and it is inflexible. And also around half of LPAs, for various variety of reasons, still don't have a CIL charging schedule in place. CIL is also required to be payable usually at the start of the development before as development commences. And the other big issue is that obviously affordable housing itself cannot be delivered using CIL. So where you have authorities with CIL charging schedules, Section 106 agreements are often required in any event to capture affordable housing, and can be a necessity for many developments in any event. So government wanted to obviously simplify the approach to a national infrastructure levy. It would be a set value-based flat rate charge, and charged on the final value of development and at point of occupation. There would be a minimum threshold below which it wouldn't be charged, and councils would be able to borrow against the infrastructure levy revenues to fund infrastructure. It would also cover the provision of affordable housing with in-kind delivery, affordable housing delivery built on site and then being deducted from the levy charge. However, with most planning reform ideas, there's been some opposition to the idea of a single national rate for the levy, mainly due to the differences in land values across the country, and that charging a single rate would disproportionately impact areas with lower land values but higher infrastructure costs. So typically you've got more northern towns and cities. Equally on this point, the Planning Select Committee, I think earlier this year, recently advised that if the government does proceed with its infrastructure levy proposal, it needs to look again at more localised rates. Whether that would be set at a district or sub-regional or regional level, we don't know, but should reflect local land values. And this approach, albeit again we are waiting for details, but it seems to have been endorsed by Robert Jenrick, Planning Minister, at the Local Government Association conference earlier this month. So again, unknowns at the moment, but change is likely to be coming in the near future. Very quickly, I just wanted to touch on revisions to the standard housing method. The standard housing method is the calculation by which government sets the number of houses that are built across the country. This has got a lot of publicity, and it unleashed a bit of a political and media storm, particularly amongst high-profile Conservative backbenchers, where much of the housing would be located in their constituencies. This led to the proposal being dubbed the mutant algorithm in the media. And the government indicated that it would be reviewing these draft proposals, which it did, and its answer was to scrap those original proposals, revert back to the method that it introduced in 2018, which effectively will leave many of the rural and county shires as you are, but with a modification to top up the housing numbers in the 20 largest cities and urban areas by 35%. This reflects government's objectives to drive housing into existing urban areas and to encourage brownfield development, which is obviously a sensible idea. But the 35% increase shouldn't be underestimated, because that is a serious amount of housing delivery, and it's going in cities where there are certain locations where there's pressures. If you take Brighton as example as being one of those cities, I mean, obviously half the land surrounding Brighton is the sea, and there's also a massive national park on one side. So, they're going to have challenges. And if you look directly at the southwest, obviously Bristol and Plymouth fall into those 20 largest cities. Again, their housing numbers are high, and you've got to think that there's going to be a challenge there in terms of meeting those numbers, but also potentially pressures on the local authorities that neighbour and surround those authority areas. I just wanted to also touch very quickly on digitalisation and technology. That's a big theme of the white paper. Central government advised that the planning process would be increasingly digitised and move from a process based on documents to a process driven by data. Local authorities would be helped, I think, with funding to use digital tools to support and encourage civic engagement in the process for adopting local plans and decision making. I suppose, just personally speaking from my own experience, lockdown has seen the emergence of many virtual parish council meetings, virtual planning committees, and my professional experience is that this has only been a positive measure. Meetings and events that were traditionally only accessible to a certain demographic, audiences that could obviously maybe retired or with a lot of time on their hands that could give up time at certain times of the day. They could now potentially, with a click of a button, be accessible to all. So the government have argued that this would draw in a younger audience to planning, be more inclusive, and I can only endorse those comments really. Other issues, I'll just fly through these very quickly. Other headline issues: heavier scrutiny and penalties for councils that fail to determine applications within the statutory time limits are considered, which could include the automatic refund of planning fees for applications. I know that's been mentioned previously, and I think would be a bit of a political nightmare, to be honest. Instead of, also this is an interesting one, instead of general development control policies, local plans would be required to set out, as I touched on earlier, the local plans would set out site and area specific requirements for development, coupled with their locally produced design codes. And that would be the local plan, and then essentially the NPPF would become the primary source of policies for day-to-day development management. Finally, timescales for producing local plans. Councils and the planning inspectorate would be required to adhere to a new statutory timetable of no more than 30 months for plan preparation, with sanctions for those who fail to do so. Now, anybody that takes part in the local plan process like we do will know that that timescale is a tough ask, to be honest, in terms of the amount of evidence. Well, an impossible task potentially. But the amount of evidence that is required to inform local plans, be interesting to see if that one actually does come through in the into legislation. So where are we now? And just to kind of wrap things up and conclude, obviously having mentioned all of the above items, there is a lot to do before these changes are forthcoming. But also the other thing is recently, in terms of certain commentators and political announcements, it does suggest that the proposed reform is in a slight state of flux. Ultimately, we await sight of the planning bill, the document which will obviously take all the white paper ideas, or some of the white paper ideas, forward as legislation. This was listed in the Queen's speech earlier in the year, and I think it's been forecast to make its first appearance in the autumn. However, we've not seen any text, or in fact, going a step back, any government responses to the consultation on its white paper, which has generated over 40,000 responses. So ultimately, the white paper was announced to great fanfare in August 2020. The Prime Minister promising to take the planning system, to tear it down and start again. However, several backbench revolts later and such like, Robert Jenrick, the Secretary of State for Housing, Communities and Local Governments, has actually stated earlier this month that it won't be a ripping apart and starting again. So it is slightly unclear. I think clearly the simplifying of the planning system would be welcomed by those who use it. However, it is going to take a number of years before the proposals within the white paper, if they are taken forward, are in place. So I think overall our advice would be at this stage would be to watch this space. Don't change all your plans just yet, because it might be a while before anything comes into effect. Thank you. I'll now hand back to Steve.
Thanks for that. Thanks for that, Dan. Certainly a lot going on in the planning sector at the moment, and as you say, we wait to see the detail emerge on some of these proposals in the coming months and years. Thanks also to Greg and Tim for your interesting insights. So we're now going to turn to questions from the audience. I can see that we've had a couple of questions in already. We still have 5 minutes or so before we will look to bring this session to an end. So if you'd like to ask any of our panelists a question, then please just pop a comment in the chat box. And any that we can't get to now, we'll look to offer a response after the webinar is finished. So please do fire away. One question here. Do you think these levels of demand will continue for rural and coastal properties after the pandemic is over? It's probably one for me. I think for a lot of employers, appear to be adopting this sort of hybrid working model for their staff, this sort of 2-3 days a week in the office type of arrangement. So I think the need for additional space at home will continue. As will this sort of desire to work in more rural and coastal settings, away from urban centres. So I think we will see demand remain high for this type of property, especially at the higher end of the market, for some time to come, I think. And that will of course support prices, going forward as well.
I think. Can I just add to that? Because I think
sure.
We did a recent analysis, as you know, with the development in the South Hams that we're involved in, and I think the overall view from the market there was that demand will probably level off. So I don't disagree with what you said, but it won't be as crazy as it's been. But the biggest issue is the lack of supply. And
Sure.
I think the question was, how prices can continue to increase. And I think that, the market will drop off, but because of the lack of supply, there's still going to be a push for the push on values of houses is still going to be upwards. Yeah,
sure. Another question here, Greg, which you might want to pick up. In Plymouth, we're experiencing a lack of contractors willing to tender. Is this a problem in the rest of the Southwest, or is it only Plymouth where house prices are not keeping pace with increasing costs?
I think it's a countrywide phenomenon, and it's particularly relevant, I think, in the Southwest. In terms of getting contractors, I think we've got to get used to the fact that it's a very, very competitive market, and we can't push contractors like we used to push them in terms of doing competitive tenders and getting them to screw the price down. And I think the way forward, certainly in the short term, is going to be partnerships and working better with contractors and subcontractors on an open book basis, because the uncertainty around costs at the moment, the uncertainty around staff supplies, means that it's very, very difficult to price anything. I mean, we recently had a price for to build a new doctor's surgery, and we signed a contract. Well, within a month, the contractor's coming back to us saying that they just can't build it for the price that they'd signed up to. And then we, as I alluded to earlier on, in terms of where you sit now with that contract, and I think there's no point in us trying to screw them and make them build it for what we said, because it's just not going to happen. With the price increases, you have to be complacent. You're not complacent. You have to be compliant with with what's going on, and that's where I'm saying again about projects maybe stalling at the moment, because I think it's going to come back to the developer. We hold the responsibility. You can't pass the responsibility to a contractor at the moment. It's just not possible. So there with thought, building in your contingencies, building in potential price rises. We need to do that when you're doing your appraisals.
Thanks a lot for that, Greg. Dan, one here for you. Do you expect the number of affordable homes delivered will reduce under the new infrastructure levy proposal?
Come and ask you as the viability expert. I don't know. I don't think we. It's hard to tell at this moment, because we don't know at what level those is it going to be? Is that levy going to be set at? If it was national, you guess maybe, because obviously if it was a blanket rate, then that is going to have a disproportionate impact on certain areas, depending, I suppose, on the number of economic factors. If it's set at a more locally balanced rate, and we don't know how local it could be, then obviously it will be able to be more bespoke and take account of more localized factors. So potentially not, but not wishing to cop out. Too early to say, really.
Yeah. No. Okay. Fine. I see we are running out of time, so perhaps we'll just have time for one more question, which Tim, perhaps you'd like to pick this one up. Question here from Kate. Are developments changing to offer back increased outside space following the pandemic? Are redevelopments of buildings to residential now seen to be required to offer flats for balconies, for example? Tim, you got any thoughts on that?
This is an interesting one. And I am having this chat with agents and developers all the time. There is a real, I think the strongest notion in the market is that the adjustment to living practices and the drivers of people's demand for new space is potentially going to be short-lived. We have seen a mass exodus of the city area and metropolitan areas, and a massive uptick in demand in the country and by the coast. Will this be sustained? If life does go back to normal and the cities turn back to the vibrant metropolises they were, the people who did live there and enjoyed living there, I think, will be driven back to those places. And I think that we'll see some sort of balance in demand and price growth in these areas. I think we are also going to see, I think in the short term, we have definitely seen the demand for houses with open space, flats with open space. We've seen clearly there's been a fall in demand for flats in the market. But again, I don't think this is going to be long term. I think people will in the short term still remember this time and how bad it was. And I know people who've lived in flats with no outside space for the whole period, and they are certainly, I don't think they'd move back to that. So I think it's still going to be horses for courses, but I don't suspect that developers will be going out of their way to reduce the efficiency and saleable area of their properties to increase, say, by 25% a garden. I think we're still going to be looking at the same type of product, albeit the flatted elements might be a slightly different proposition.
Steve, can I add to that as well? Because I think I've seen a couple of things recently. I saw one development, a small development in the Teambridge area, where they had redesigned the property to make it a much larger apartment to include 2 offices. So the assumption that 2 people were going to be working from home in an office, each with an office, which was quite an interesting idea. But it obviously, makes the buildings much, much larger. But I think one of the biggest challenges for the industry again is how you cope with home working, especially in much of the larger developments where houses are relatively modest. might be complying with standards, but there's not a lot of space for a home office, and therefore creating home offices and community space and shared office space within a community, I think is going to become quite important. So going back to that, that place-making responsibility within a development where you've got more than just the house. You've got the village hall, or you've got the community space where someone can have an office, or a coffee shop which has got a meeting at the back of it. That's going to be really important. I think developers have got a great opportunity to add value to their houses on a price per square metre, if that within walking distance of that house, you've got an office that you can use, or a coffee shop you can use, or some space you can go out and get a bit of space in your head during the middle of the day when you've been working since 7 o'clock in the morning, and go and walk around somewhere nice. So I think there's an opportunity to add value with residential developments if we think about it now, and if we think about how we can add value to a house.
Just jumping back in, Greg, sorry, Dan, but the PRS model is certainly interesting in how things have evolved over the last year, because clearly that model relies on smaller space per unit, but much more higher levels of communal space. And going forward, is that really what buyers are going to be looking to get into? I know from last year that a lot of this communal space, it was just closed down. People restricted their flats. They couldn't go and enjoy the real upsides in living in those places. So I think it'll be interesting how the market reacts to the PRS model going forward as well.
Dan, do you want to have just one last comment then?
Just very, very quickly, very quick point, just interesting this point on flipping it around from a planning policy point of view. It'll be interesting to see how local authorities react to the pandemic when they're kind of updating their local plans, because in terms of space standards, obviously the focus is primarily on internal space, isn't it? In terms of making sure internal rooms are of a certain size. Looking at Devon and Cornwall, for example, South Hams are one of the few authorities that have a local plan with minimum garden sizes and those outdoor spaces. But I would say that they're in the minority. So yeah, just as a general point, it would be interesting to see how that comes through in planning policy, if it does. Sure.
Well, thanks a lot, everyone, for your insights there. We have run over, so we are definitely out of time, so we'll wrap it up there. Thank you all for joining us today. I hope the content has been interesting and informative. As I mentioned at the start, we are looking to run another webinar later on in the year. So if there are any topics you would like to see us cover, then do please let us know, and we'll see what we can do. Feel free, of course, to pop any one of us an email or give us a call if there is anything specific you would like to talk to us about. Our details will be appearing on screen shortly, or there they are. A special thanks to our guest speaker, Dan Rodgers, today. It's been really great to have you on board this morning, Dan. Hope you can join us again at a future event. Thanks to my colleagues, Tim and Greg, and also to Leslie Anderson from Hedgerow Marketing, who has made this event possible today. If there are any colleagues or contacts of yours who you think may be interested in what we've had to speak about today, then there will be a video recording on our YouTube channel, which you can find via our website. So thanks again, and hope to see you all again soon. Cheers.